Book 10, Chapter 10 of the Antiquities of the Jews, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Recording by Karen. The Antiquities of the Jews, Volume 2 by Flavius Josephus. Translated by William Whiston. Book 10, Chapter 10. Chapter 10, concerning Daniel and what befell him at Babylon. But now Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, took some of the most noble of the Jews that were children, and the kinsmen of Zedekiah their king, such as were remarkable for the beauty of their bodies and the comeliness of their countenances, and delivered them into the hands of tutors, and to the improvements to be made by them. He also made some of them to be eunuchs, which course he took also with those of other nations whom he had taken in the flower of their age, and afforded them their diet from his own table, and had them instructed in the institutes of the country, and taught the learning of the Chaldeans. And they had now exercised themselves sufficiently in that wisdom which he had ordered they should apply themselves to. Now among these there were 4 of the family of Zedekiah, of most excellent dispositions, one of whom was called Daniel, another was called Ananias, another Misael, and the 4th Azarias. And the king of Babylon changed their names, and commanded that they should make use of other names. Daniel he called Balthazar, Ananias Shadrach, Misael Meshach, and Azarias Abednego. These the king had in esteem and continued to love, because of the very excellent temper they were of, and because of their application to learning, and the profess they had made in wisdom. Now Daniel and his kinsmen had resolved to use a severe diet, and to abstain from those kinds of food which came from the king's table, and entirely to forbear to eat of all living creatures. So he came to Ashpenaz, who was that eunuch to whom the care of them was committed, and desired him to take and spend what was brought for them from the king, but to give them pulse and dates for their food, and anything else besides the flesh of living creatures that he pleased, for that their inclinations were to that sort of food, and that they despised the other. He replied that he was ready to serve them in what they desired, but he suspected that they would be discovered by the king from their meager bodies and the alteration of their countenances, because it could not be avoided but their bodies and colors must be changed with their diet, especially while they would be clearly discovered by the finer appearance of the other children, who would fare better, and thus they should bring him into danger and occasion him to be punished. Yet did they persuade Arioch, who was thus fearful, to give them what food they desired for 10 days by way of trial, and in case the habit of their bodies were not altered, to go on in the same way, as expecting that they should not be hurt thereby afterwards. But if he saw them look meager and worse than the rest, he should reduce them to their former diet. Now, when it appeared that they were so far from becoming worse by the use of this food, that they grew plumper and fuller in body than the rest, insomuch that he thought those who fed on what came from the king's table seemed less plump and full, while those that were with Daniel looked as if they had lived in plenty and in all sorts of luxury. Arioch from that time securely took himself what the king sent every day from his supper, according to custom, to the children, but gave them the forementioned diet, while they had their souls in some measure more pure and less burdened, and so fitter for learning, and had their bodies in better tune for hard labor. For they neither had the former oppressed and heavy with a variety of meats, nor were the other effeminate on the same account. So they readily understood all the learning that was among the Hebrews and among the Chaldeans, as especially did Daniel, who being already sufficiently skillful in wisdom, was very busy about the interpretation of dreams, and God manifested himself to him. Now, 2 years after the destruction of Egypt, King Nebuchadnezzar saw a wonderful dream, the accomplishment of which God showed him in his sleep. But when he rose out of his bed, he forgot the accomplishment. So he sent for the Chaldeans and magicians and the prophets, and told them that he had seen a dream, and informed them that he had forgotten the accomplishment of what he had seen. And he enjoined them to tell him both what the dream was, and what was its signification. And they said that this was a thing impossible to be discovered by men, But they promised him that if he would explain to them what dream he had seen, they would tell him its signification. Hereupon he threatened to put them to death, unless they told him his dream. And he gave command to have them all put to death, since they confessed they could not do what they were commanded to do. Now when Daniel heard that the king had given a command that all the wise men should be put to death, and among them himself and his 3 kinsmen were in danger, he went to Arioch, who was captain of the king's guards, and desired to know of him what was the reason why the king had given command that all the wise men and Chaldeans and magicians should be slain. So when he learned that the king had had a dream and had forgotten it, and that when they were enjoined to inform the king of it, they had said they could not do it, and had thereby provoked him to anger, he desired of Arioch that he would go into the king and desire respite from the magicians for 1 night, and to put off their slaughter so long, for that he hoped within that time to obtain, by prayer to God, the knowledge of the dream. Accordingly, Arioch informed the king of what Daniel desired. So the king bid them delay the slaughter of the magicians till he knew what Daniel's promise would come to. But the young man retired to his own house with his kinsmen, and besought God that whole night to discover the dream, and thereby deliver the magicians and Chaldeans, with whom they were themselves to perish, from the king's anger, by enabling him to declare his vision, and to make manifest what the king had seen the night before in his sleep, but had forgotten it. Accordingly, God, out of pity to those that were in danger, and out of regard to the wisdom of Daniel, made known to him the dream and its interpretation, that so the king might understand by him its signification also. When Daniel had obtained this knowledge from God, he arose very joyful, and told it his brethren, and made them glad, and to hope well that they should now preserve their lives, of which they despaired before, and had their minds full of nothing but the thoughts of dying. So when he had with them returned, thanks to God, who had commiserated their youth, when it was day, he came to Arioch, and desired him to bring him to the king, because he would discover to him that dream which he had seen the night before. When Daniel was come into the king, he excused himself first, that he did not pretend to be wiser than the other Chaldeans and magicians, when upon their entire inability to discover his dream, he was undertaking to inform him of it. For this was not by his own skill, or on account of his having been better cultivated his understanding than the rest. But he said, God hath had pity upon us when we were in danger of death, and when I prayed for the life of myself and of those of my own nation, hath made manifest to me both the dream and the interpretation thereof. For I was not less concerned for thy glory than for the sorrow that we were by thee condemned to die, while thou didst so unjustly command men, both good and excellent in themselves, to be put to death, when thou enjoinedst them to do what was entirely above the reach of human wisdom, and requiredst of them what was only the work of God. Wherefore, as thou in thy sleep wast solicitous concerning those that should succeed thee in the government of the whole world, God was desirous to show thee all those that should reign after thee, and to that end exhibited to thee the following dream. Thou seemedst to see a great image standing before thee, the head of which proved to be of gold, the shoulders and arms of silver, and the belly and the thighs of brass, but the legs and the feet of iron. After which thou sawest a stone broken off from a mountain, which fell upon the image, and threw it down, and brake it to pieces, and did not permit any part of it to remain whole. But the gold, the silver, the brass, and the iron became smaller than meal, upon which the blast of a violent wind was by force carried away and scattered abroad. But the stone did increase to such a degree that the whole earth beneath it seemed to be filled therewith. This is the dream which thou sawest, and its interpretation is as follows. The head of gold denotes thee and the kings of Babylon that have been before thee. But the 2 hands and arms signify this, that your government shall be dissolved by 2 kings. But another king that shall come from the west, armed with brass, shall destroy that government, and another government that shall be like unto iron shall put an end to the power of the former, and shall have dominion over all the earth, on account of the nature of iron, which is stronger than that of gold, of silver, and of brass. Daniel did also declare the meaning of the stone to the king, but I do not think proper to relate it. since I have only undertaken to describe things past or things present, but not things that are future. Yet, if anyone be so very desirous of knowing truth as not to waive such points of curiosity, and cannot curb his inclination for understanding the uncertainties of futurity, and whether they will happen or not, let him be diligent in reading the book of Daniel, which he will find among the sacred writings. When Nebuchadnezzar heard this and recollected his dream, he was astonished at the nature of Daniel, and fell upon his knee, and saluted Daniel in the manner that men worship God, and gave command that he should be sacrificed to as a god. And this was not all, for he also imposed the name of his own god upon him, Belteshazzar, and made him and his kinsmen rulers of his whole kingdom, which kinsmen of his happened to fall into great danger by the envy and malice of their enemies, for they offended the king upon the occasion following. He made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits, and its breadth 6 cubits, and set it in the great plain of Babylon. And when he was going to dedicate the image, he invited the principal men out of all the earth that was under his dominions, and commanded them in the first place, that when they should hear the sound of the trumpet, they should then fall down and worship the image. And he threatened that those who did not do so should be cast into a fiery furnace. When therefore all the rest, upon the hearing of the sound of the trumpet, worshipped the image, they relate that Daniel's kinsmen did not do it, because they would not transgress the laws of their country. So these men were convicted and cast immediately into the fire, but were saved by divine providence, and after a surprising manner escaped death, for the fire did not touch them. And I suppose that it touched them not, as if it reasoned with itself that they were cast into it without any fault of theirs, and that therefore it was too weak to burn the young men when they were in it. This was done by the power of God, who made their bodies so far superior to the fire that it could not consume them. This it was which recommended them to the king as righteous men, and men beloved of God, on which account they continued in great esteem with him. A little after this, the king saw in his sleep again another vision, how he should fall from his dominion and feed among the wild beasts, and that when he had lived in this manner in the desert for 7 years, he should recover his dominion again. When he had seen this dream, he called the magicians together again, and inquired of them about it, and desired them to tell him what it signified. But when none of them could find out the meaning of the dream, nor discover it to the king, Daniel was the only person that explained it. And as he foretold, so it came to pass. For after he had continued in the wilderness the forementioned interval of time, while no one durst attempt to seize his kingdom during those 7 years, he prayed to God that he might recover his kingdom, and he returned to it. But let no one blame me for writing down everything of this nature, as I find it in our ancient books. For as to that matter, I have plainly assured those that think me defective in any such point, or complain of my management, and have told them in the beginning of this history that I intended to do no more than translate the Hebrew books into the Greek language, and promised them to explain those facts, without adding anything to them of my own, or taking anything away from there. End of Book 10, Chapter 10. Recording by Karen.
Book 10, Chapter 11 of the Antiquities of the Jews, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Antiquities of the Jews, Volume 2, by Flavius Josephus. Translated by William Whiston. Book 10, Chapter 11. Chapter 11. Concerning Nebuchadnezzar and his successors, and how their government was dissolved by the Persians, and what things befell Daniel in Media, and what prophecies he delivered there. Now when King Nebuchadnezzar had reigned 43 years, he ended his life. He was an active man, and more fortunate than the kings that were before him. Now Berosus makes mention of his actions in the 3rd book of his Chaldaic history, where he says thus: When his father, Nabopolassar, heard that the governor whom he had set over Egypt, and the places about Coelesyria and Phoenicia had revolted from him, while he was not himself able any longer to undertake the hardships of war, he committed to his son Nebuchadnezzar, who was still but a youth, some parts of his army, and sent them against him. So when Nebuchadnezzar had given battle, and fought with the rebel, he beat him, and reduced the country from under his subjection, and made it a branch of his own kingdom. But about that time it happened that his father, Nabopolassar, fell ill, and ended his life in the city of Babylon, where he had reigned 21 years. And when he was made sensible, as he was in a little time, that his father, Nabopolassar, was dead, and having settled the affairs of Egypt, and the other countries, as also those that concerned the captive Jews, and Phoenicians, and Syrians, and those of the Egyptian nations, and having committed the conveyance of them to Babylon to certain of his friends, together with the gross of his army, and the rest of their ammunition and provisions, he went himself hastily, accompanied with a few others, over the desert, and came to Babylon. So he took upon him the management of public affairs, and of the kingdom which had been kept for him by one that was the principal of the Chaldeans, and he received the entire dominions of his father, and appointed, when the captives came, they should be placed as colonies, in the most proper places of Babylonia. But then he adorned the temple of Belus, and the rest of the temples, in a magnificent manner, with the spoils he had taken in the war. He also added another city to that which was there of old, and rebuilt it, that such as would besiege it hereafter might no more turn the course of the river, and thereby attack the city itself. He therefore built 3 walls round about the inner city, and 3 others about that which was the outer, and this he did with burnt brick. And after he had, after a becoming manner, walled the city, and adorned its gates gloriously, he built another palace before his father's palace, so that they joined to it, to describe whose vast height and immense riches it would perhaps be too much for me to attempt, yet as large and lofty as they were completed in 15 days. He also erected elevated places for walking, of stone, and made it resemble mountains, and built it so that it might be planted with all sorts of trees. He also erected what was called a pensile paradise, because his wife was desirous to have things like her own country, she having been bred up in the palaces of Media. Megisthenes also, in his 4th book of his accounts of India, makes mention of these things, and thereby endeavors to show that this king, Nebuchadnezzar, exceeded Hercules in fortitude, and in the greatness of his actions. For he saith that he conquered a great part of Libya and Iberia. Diocles also, in the 2nd book of his accounts of Persia, mentions this king, as does Philostrates in his accounts book both of India and of Phoenicia, say that this king besieged Tyre 13 days, while at the same time Ethbaal reigned at Tyre. These are all the histories that I have met with concerning this king. But now, after the death of Nebuchadnezzar, Evil-Merodach his son succeeded in the kingdom, who immediately set Jeconiah at liberty, and esteemed him among his most intimate friends. He also gave him many presents, and made him honorable above the rest of the kings that were in Babylon, for his father had not kept his faith with Jeconiah, when he voluntarily delivered up himself to him, with his wives and children, and his whole kindred, for the sake of his country, that it might not be taken by siege, and utterly destroyed, as we said before. When Evil-Merodach was king, after a reign of 18 years, Niglasar his son took the government, and retained it 40 years, and then ended his life. And after him the succession in the kingdom came to his son Laborsadocus, who continued in it all but 9 months, and when he was dead, it came to Baltasar, who by the Babylonians was called Nabonidus. Against him did Cyrus the king of Persia, and Darius the king of Media make war. And when he was besieged in Babylon, there happened a wonderful and prodigious vision. He was sat down at supper in a large room, and there were a great many vessels of silver, such as were made for royal entertainments, and he had with him his concubines and his friends, whereupon he came to a resolution, and commanded that those vessels of God which Nebuchadnezzar had plundered out of Jerusalem, and had not made use of, but had put them into his own temple, should be brought out of that temple. He also grew so haughty as to proceed to use them in the midst of his cups, drinking out of them, and blaspheming against God. In the meantime, he saw a hand proceed out of the wall, and writing upon the wall certain syllables, at which sight, being disturbed, he called the magicians and Chaldeans together, and all that sort of men who are among these barbarians, and were able to interpret signs and dreams, that they might explain the writing to him. But when the magicians said they could discover nothing, nor did understand it, the king was in great disorder of mind, and under great trouble at this surprising accident. So he caused it to be proclaimed through all the country, and promised, that to him who could explain the writing, and give the signification couched therein, he would give him a golden chain for his neck, and leave to wear a purple garment, as did the kings of Chaldea, and would bestow on him the third part of his own dominions. When this proclamation was made, the magicians ran together more earnestly, and were very ambitious to find out the importance of the writing, but still hesitated about it as much as before. Now when the king's grandmother saw him cast down at this accident, she began to encourage him, and to say, that there was a certain captive who came from Judea, a Jew by birth, but brought away thence by Nebuchadnezzar when he had destroyed Jerusalem, whose name was Daniel, a wise man, and one of great sagacity in finding out what was impossible for others to discover, and what was known to God alone, who brought to light and answered such questions to Nebuchadnezzar as no one else was able to answer when they were consulted. She therefore desired that he would send for him, and inquire of him concerning the writing, and to condemn the unskilfulness of those that could not find their meaning, and this, although what God signified thereby should be of a melancholy nature. When Balthasar heard this, he called for Daniel, and when he had discoursed to him what he had learned concerning him in his wisdom, and how a divine spirit was with him, and that he alone was fully capable of finding out what others would never have thought of, he desired him to declare to him what this writing meant, that if he did so, he would give him leave to wear purple, and to put a chain of gold about his neck, and would bestow on him the third part of his dominion, as an honorary reward for his wisdom, that thereby he might become illustrious to those who saw him, and who inquired upon what occasion he obtained such honors. But Daniel desired that he would keep his gifts to himself, for what is the effect of wisdom and of divine revelation admits of no gifts, and bestows its advantages on petitioners freely, but that he would still explain the writing to him, which denoted that he should soon die, and this because he had not learnt to honor God, and not to admit things above human nature, by what punishments his progenitor had undergone for the injuries he had offered to God, and because he had quite forgotten how Nebuchadnezzar was removed to feed among wild beasts for his impieties, and did not recover his former life among men in his kingdom, but upon God's mercy to him, after many supplications and prayers, who did thereupon praise God all the days of his life, as one of almighty power, and who takes care of mankind. He also put him in mind how he had greatly blasphemed against God, and had made use of his vessels amongst his concubines, that therefore God saw this, and was angry with him, and declared by this writing beforehand what a sad conclusion his life should come to. And he explained the writing thus: Manna, that is, if it be expounded in the Greek language, may signify a number, because God hath numbered so long a time for thy life, and for thy government, and that there remains but a small portion. Thekel, this signifies a weight, and means that God hath weighed thy kingdom in balance, and finds it going down already. Pharis, this also in the Greek tongue denotes a fragment. God will therefore break thy kingdom in pieces, and divide it among the Medes and Persians. When Daniel had told the king that the writing upon the wall signified these events, Balthasar was in great sorrow and affliction, as was to be expected, when the interpretation was so heavy upon him. However, he did not refuse what he had promised Daniel, although he were become a foreteller of misfortunes to him, but bestowed it all upon him, as reasoning thus, that what he was to reward was peculiar to himself, and to fate, and did not belong to the prophet, but that it was the part of a good and just man to give what he had promised, although the events were of a melancholy nature. Accordingly, the king determined to do so. Now after a little while, both himself and the city were taken by Cyrus the king of Persia, who fought against him, for it was Balthasar under whom Babylon was taken, when he had reigned 17 years. And this is the end of the posterity of King Nebuchadnezzar, as history informs us. But when Babylon was taken by Darius, and when he, with his kinsman Cyrus, had put an end to the dominion of the Babylonians, he was 62 years old. He was the son of Astyages, and had another name among the Greeks. Moreover, he took Daniel the prophet, and carried him with him into Media, and honored him very greatly, and kept him with him, for he was one of the 3 presidents whom he set over his 360 provinces, for into so many did Darius part them. However, while Daniel was in so great dignity, and in so great favor with Darius, and was alone entrusted with everything by him, having somewhat divine in him, he was envied by the rest, for those that see others in greater honor than themselves with kings envy them, and when those that were grieved at the favor Daniel was in with Darius sought for an occasion against him, he afforded them no occasion at all, for he was above all the temptations of money, and despised bribery, and esteemed it a very base thing to take anything by way of reward, even when it might be justly given him. He afforded those that envied him not the least handle for an accusation. So when they could find nothing for which they might calumniate him to the king, nothing that was shameful or reproachful, and thereby deprive him of the honor he was in with him, they sought for some other method whereby they might destroy him. When therefore they saw that Daniel prayed to God 3 times a day, they thought they had gotten an occasion by which they might ruin him, so they came to Darius and told him that the princes and governors had thought proper to allow the multitude a relaxation for 30 days, that no one might offer a petition or prayer either to himself or to the gods, but that he who shall transgress this decree shall be cast into the den of lions, and there perish. Whereupon the king, not being acquainted with their wicked design, nor suspecting that it was a contrivance of theirs against Daniel, said that he was pleased with this decree of theirs, and he promised to confirm what they desired. He also published an edict to promulgate to the people that decree which the princes had made. Accordingly, all the rest took care not to transgress those injunctions, and rested in quiet. But Daniel had no regard to them, but, as he was wont, he stood and prayed to God in the sight of them all. But the princes, having met with the occasion they so earnestly sought to find against Daniel, came presently to the king and accused him, that Daniel was the only person that transgressed the decree, while not one of the rest durst pray to their gods. This discovery they made, not because of his impiety, but because they had watched him, and observed him out of envy. For supposing that Darius did thus out of a greater kindness to him than they expected, and that he was ready to grant him pardon for this contempt of his injunctions, and envying this very pardon to Daniel, they did not become more honorable to him, but desired he might be cast into the den of lions according to the law. So Darius, hoping that God would deliver him, and that he would undergo nothing that was terrible by the wild beasts, bid him bear this accident cheerfully. And when he was cast into the den, he put his seal to the stone that lay upon the mouth of the den, and went his way, but he passed all the night without food and without sleep, being in great distress for Daniel. But when it was day, he got up, and came to the den, and found the seal entire, which he had left the stone sealed withal. He also opened the seal, and cried out, and called to Daniel, and asked him if he were alive. And as soon as he heard the king's voice, and said that he had suffered no harm, the king gave order that he should be drawn up out of the den. Now when his enemies saw that Daniel had suffered nothing which was terrible, they would not own that he was preserved by God, and by his providence, but they said that the lions had been filled with food, and on account it was, as they supposed, that the lions would not touch Daniel, nor come to him, and this they alleged to the king. But the king, out of an abhorrence of their wickedness, gave order that they should throw in a great deal of flesh to the lions, and when they had filled themselves, he gave further order that Daniel's enemies should be cast into the den, that he might learn whether the lions, now they were full, would touch them or not. And it appeared plain to Darius, after the princes had been cast into the wild beast, that it was God who preserved Daniel, for the lions spared none of them, but tore them all to pieces, as if they had been very hungry, and wanted food. I suppose therefore it was not their hunger, which had been a little before satisfied with abundance of flesh, but the wickedness of these men, that provoked them to destroy the princes. For if it so please God, that wickedness might try, by even those irrational creatures, be esteemed a plain foundation for their punishment. When therefore those that had intended to thus destroy Daniel by treachery were themselves destroyed, King Darius sent letters all over the country, and praised that God whom Daniel worshipped, and said that he was the only true God, and had all power. He had also Daniel in very great esteem, and made him the principal of his friends. Now when Daniel was become so illustrious and famous, on account of the opinion men had that he was beloved of God, He built a tower at Ecbatana in Media. It was a most elegant building and wonderfully made, and it is still remaining, and preserved to this day, and to such as see it, it appears to have been but lately built, and to have been no older than that very day when any one looks upon it. It is so fresh, flourishing, and beautiful, and in no way grown old in so long a time. For buildings suffer the same as men do; they grow old as well as they, and by numbers of years their strength is dissolved, and their beauty withered. Now they bury the kings of Media, of Persia, and Parthia in this tower to this day, and he who was entrusted with the care of it was a Jewish priest, which thing is also observed to this day. But it is fit to give an account of what this man did, which is most admirable to hear, for he was so happy as to have strange revelations made to him, and those as to one of the greatest of the prophets, insomuch that while he was alive he had the esteem and applause both of the kings and of the multitude. And now he is dead, he retains a remembrance that will never fail, for the several books that he wrote and left behind him are still read by us till this time, and from them we believe that Daniel conversed with God, for he did not only prophesy of future events, as did the other prophets, but he also determined the time of their accomplishment. And while prophets used to foretell misfortunes, and on that account were disagreeable both to the kings and to the multitude, Daniel was to them a prophet of good things, and this to such a degree, that by the agreeable nature of his predictions he procured the goodwill of all men, and by the accomplishment of them he procured the belief of their truth, and the opinion of a sort of divinity for himself among the multitude. He also wrote and left behind him what made manifest the accuracy and undeniable veracity of his predictions, for he saith that when he was in Susa, the metropolis of Persia, and went out into the field with his companions, there was on the sudden a motion and concussion of the earth, and that he was left alone by himself, his friends fleeing away from him, and that he was disturbed, and fell on his face, and on his 2 hands, and that a certain person touched him, and at the same time bid him rise, to see what would befall his countrymen after many generations. He also related that when he stood up he was shown a great ram, with many horns growing out of his head, and that the last was higher than the rest; that after this he looked to the west, and saw a he-goat carried through the air from that quarter; that he rushed upon the ram with violence, and smote him twice with his horns, and overthrew him to the ground, and trampled upon him; that afterward he saw a very great horn growing out of the head of the he-goat, and that when it was broken off, 4 horns grew up that were exposed to each of the 4 winds; and he wrote that out of them arose another lesser horn, which, as he said, waxed great, and that God showed to him that it should fight against his nation, and take their city by force, and bring the temple worship to confusion, and forbid the sacrifices to be offered for 1,296 days. Daniel wrote that he saw these visions in the plain of Susa, and he hath informed us that God interpreted the appearance of this vision after the following manner. He said that the ram signified the kingdoms of the Medes and Persians, and the horns those kings that were to reign in them, and that the last horn signified the last king, and that he should exceed all the kings in riches and glory; that the he-goat signified that one should come and reign from the Greeks, who should twice fight with the Persian and overcome him in battle, and should receive his entire dominion; that by the great horn which sprang out of the forehead of the he-goat was meant the first king, and that the springing up of 4 horns upon its falling off, and the conversion of every one of them to the 4 quarters of the earth, signified the successors that should arise after the death of the first king, and the partition of his kingdom among them, and that they should be neither his children nor of his kindred, and that they should reign over the habitable earth for many years, and that from them there should arise a certain king that should overcome our nation and their laws, and should take away their political government, and should spoil the temple, and forbid the sacrifices to be offered for 3 years' time. And indeed it so came to pass, that our nation suffered these things under Antiochus Epiphanes, according to Daniel's vision, and what he wrote many years before they came to pass. In the very same manner Daniel also wrote concerning the Roman government, and that our country should be made desolate by them. All these things did this man leave in writing, as God had showed them to him, insomuch that such as read his prophecies, and see how they have been fulfilled, would wonder at the honor wherewith God honored Daniel, and may thence discover how the Epicureans are in an error, who cast providence out of human life, and do not believe that God takes care of the affairs of the world, nor that the universe is governed and continued in being by that blessed and immortal nature, but say that the world is carried along of its own accord, without a ruler and a curator, which, were it destitute of a guide to conduct it as they imagine, it would be like ships without pilots, which we see drowned by the winds, or like chariots without drivers, which are overturned. So would the world be dashed to pieces by its being carried without a providence, and so perish, and come to naught. So that, by the forementioned practices of Daniel, those men seem to me very much to err from the truth, who determine that God exercises no providence over human affairs. For if that were the case, that the world went on by mechanical necessity, we should not see that all things would come to pass according to his prophecy. Now as to myself, I have so described these matters as I have found them and read them, but if any one is inclined to another opinion about them, let him enjoy his different sentiments without any blame from me.